Here at St Margaret's Church in the small hamlet of Rattlinghope in Shropshire is the tall memorial to members of the MUNSLOW family. Richard MUNSLOW is believed to have been the last sin-eater in the region, but what was a sin-eater? Jesus of Nazareth often taught of the need to have one's sins forgiven before God, and much of Christianity concerns itself with the issue of how one can be forgiven. Of particular concern to the Church, mainly as it grew and gained power over people and the culture, was of what the fate was of people whose sins had been forgiven, but who may have had unconfessed sins before they died. Several ideas, each more bizarre than the one before, emerged as to how to deal with this predicament. The idea of purgatory developed as an intermediary place for people whose sins were forgiven but were not yet able to enter heaven, possibly because they had unconfessed sin before death. In the Middle Ages, before the Protestant Reformation, the practice of buying and selling indulgences was a means for the Church to make money by selling forgiveness. If someone had already died and was waiting in purgatory, you could buy an indulgence to get them to heaven more quickly. In some areas, particularly those with a strong Celtic pagan background, notably Scotland and Wales, the idea of sin-eating developed as a fusion between pagan culture and Christianity. The morbid tradition of sin-eating was every bit as terrifying as it sounds. The idea of sin-eating was simple. Someone was hired to eat another person's sins. As a person lay dying, someone would place a piece of bread on his or her chest, which would absorb that person's sins. However, where would that person's sins go to after that? After all, bread only lasts for a few days at best. A local pariah, known as the Sineater, would eat the piece of bread, thereby eating the deceased person's sin. The person who died would go to heaven, and the sin-eater would get paid for his or her services. The sin-eater traded his or own soul in exchange for the bit of money earned by sin-eating. He or she would absorb the sins of so many people that eternal damnation was assured. This concept was not the only example during the Middle Ages and beyond of people who traded their souls for material gain. The Faustian legend is about a man who sold his soul to the devil for another year of life on earth. Witches were believed to sell their souls to the devil in exchange for magical powers. What set the Sin-Eater's exchange apart was that he or she was able to allow another person to enter heaven. Today, anthropologists view the practice of sin-eating as an aspect of magic that protected other people from harm. One might expect that they were respected for safeguarding people's loved ones from damnation. Far from being appreciated for the valuable service that they gave to the community, however, sin-eaters were believed to be defiled with the sins that they consumed. They did not merely absolve the deceased of their sins, but absorbed them, effectively becoming sin on behalf of the community. On top of being outcasts in the next life, they were outcasts in this one as well. It was not a pleasant job. As you might imagine, sin-eating was not a practice advocated by the Church. After all, it might have taken away money to be earned by selling indulgences. Anyone caught engaging in sin-eating could be harshly punished, so communities that adhered to the practice had to do so clandestinely. That said, the ritual of sin-eating was immensely important. Without it, the dearly departed ran the risk of not being holy enough to enter heaven. As soon as someone was in the throes of death, the piece of bread would be placed on his or her chest. Once death had occurred, someone would run through the village to find the sin-eater. When the sin-eater was brought to the home of the deceased, a stool would be brought out for him or her to sit on while eating the cursed meal. The meal might consist of nothing more than an old crust of bread. Once it was consumed, he or she would usually be paid. Care had to be taken if a church minister was nearby, as the threat of execution always hung over the heads of those who engaged in the sin-eating culture. Sin-eaters performed the ultimate service for the community, the most important job there was, and were hated for it. Only the most destitute of all people would ever sign up for such a role. people who may have already thought of themselves as condemned for eternity for some sin that they had committed in the past, which could never be absolved. Without the Sineater to completely absolve the deceased of their sins, society simply would not function. People believe that not only did Sineaters enable the dearly departed to enter heaven, but they also prevented spirits from returning to earth as ghosts. After all, if their contented souls were able to reach heaven, they had no reason to wander the earth and haunt its inhabitants. The Sineater, however, would certainly return as a restless wandering spirit. After all, he or she had absorbed the sins of so many people that entrance to heaven would indeed be denied. A Sineater was usually a poor person and something of a social outcast, but Richard MUNSLOW was neither. He was a member of a respected family and farmed between 70 and 75 acres at Upper Darnford, employing 2 or 3 labourers. He would also have had grazing rights on the adjoining Longmynd and was a farmer of some substance. The MUNSLOWs came to Rattling Hope early in the 18th century, and by the middle of the 19th there were several branches of the family in the parish. James, who lived from 1793 to 1873, was Richard's great-uncle, and he was a parish clerk for many years, and others were farmers or farm workers in the Darnford Valley and around Gatton. Richard was one of the 5th generation of Rattling Hope MUNSLOWs. So why did Richard MUNSLOW revive the custom of sin-eating? Let us look at his life first. Richard MUNSLOW was born in Rattling Hope in 1833 and baptised at St Margaret's Church on the 4th of January 1833. He first appears on the 1841 census, aged 8. His father is named George MUNSLOW and he is aged 35, and his mother is Elizabeth, aged 25. The family is listed as living at Darnford. Richard has 3 siblings: John, aged 6, Mary, aged 3, and Anne, aged 8 months. Also in the house are William Hotchkiss, aged 50, and 10-year-old John Jones. The census does not say if they are relatives or servants. On the 1851 census, the family are listed as living at Upper Darnford. Head of the household now is Elizabeth MUNSLOW. She is a widow, aged 37, and a farmer of 50 acres. Richard, the eldest child, is 18, and a farmer's son and agricultural labourer. John is 16 and listed as the same. Mary is 13 and a house servant. Anne is now 11 and a scholar. There are 3 more children: George, aged 8, Elizabeth, aged 5, and Thomas, aged 2. 10 years later, in 1861, and Richard MUNSLOW is running the farm, so it's possible his mother has passed away. So Richard lost his father at the age of 44 in 1850, and his mother at the age of 39 in 1855. Richard is now aged 28 and a farmer, employing 2 men and 1 boy. He has 5 siblings living with him: John, aged 17, who is an agricultural labourer; Mary, aged 13, who is also listed as an agricultural labourer; George, aged 18, who is an agricultural labourer; Elizabeth, aged 14, and Thomas, aged 11. There is also a James Hill, who is aged 14, and he is a carter. In January 1862, Richard marries Anne Pinches, and the 1871 census shows them and their family living at Rattling Hope. Richard is 38 and he is a farmer of 70 acres, employing 1 man. Anne is aged 30. Richard's youngest brother Thomas lives with them. He is 22 and a general servant. There is also Sarah and Harriet Hotchkiss, who are both aged 2, and they are listed as boarders, and Anne Parry, aged 16, who is a general servant. In 1881, Richard is aged 49 and he is a farmer of 75 acres. Anne is aged 40. They have 2 children, Mary Ann, aged 7, and Anne, aged 4. There is also a Richard MUNSLOW, who is aged 11, and he is a nephew, and Thomas Cook, aged 41, who is a farm servant. 10 years later, in 1891, Richard is aged 58 and still a farmer. Anne is now aged 50. Their daughter Anne, down as Annie, is aged 14. Again, they have 2 nephews living with them. Robert Thomas Munslow, aged 5, and George Munslow, aged 18. The last census Richard appears on is 1901, and he is aged 68 and still a farmer. Anne is 61. Their daughter Annie is still living with them, and she is now aged 24. There is a niece in the house also. She is named Ellen, and she is 14. There is also a William Wilcox, who is 15, and he is an agricultural labourer. Looking at Richard's family history on the census, there is no sign as to why he would take up the practice of sin eating. He is not poor, he is not an outcast. He is a successful farmer with a large family, and he comes from a large family himself. So why did he take it on? What the census does not tell us is what happened between the decades. The first census Richard appears on as a married man is in 1871, having married Anne Pinches in 1862, and then 10 years later in 1881 he and his wife have 2 daughters, Mary Ann and Annie. But between the years of 1862 and 1872 they have a total of 6 children. But tragedy would strike the Munslow house. When Richard and Anne married in January 1862, Anne was either pregnant or had already given birth to their first child, George. But sadly, George was to die on the 11th of April 1862, just a few months old. Their next child, James John Munslow, was born in 1864, followed by Thomas in January 1866, Elizabeth in 1869, Mary Ann on the 31st of August 1872, and Annie in 1877. But in a matter of a week in 1870, they would lose 3 children to scarlet fever. On the 1st of May, Thomas would pass away, aged about 4 years old. The following day, the 2nd of May, James John would die, aged 6 years. And finally, on the 7th of May, Elizabeth would succumb to the disease, aged just 1 year old. Having lost both his parents at a young age and taking on the responsibility of running a large farm at the age of 22, then losing 4 of his children during infancy, could this have tested his faith, and he had secretly wished that he had succumbed to scarlet fever and not his small children? Between approximately 1820 and 1880, there was a world pandemic of scarlet fever, and several severe epidemics occurred in Europe and North America. The 19th century was marked by devastating epidemics of scarlet fever, which unveiled unimaginable pain and suffering. Scarlet fever was an infectious disease that primarily affected children and young adults. It presented with symptoms such as a high fever, sore throat, and a characteristic rash that gave the skin a bright red hue. During the 19th century, scarlet fever epidemics would sweep through communities, causing widespread fear and panic. The disease was highly contagious and easily transmitted through respiratory droplets or direct contact with infected individuals. Medical knowledge in the 19th century was limited, and there was little understanding of how to effectively treat scarlet fever. Antibiotics, which are commonly used today, were not available back then. As a result, many people suffered from the illness, and mortality rates were alarmingly high. The pain and suffering caused by scarlet fever were not only physical, but also emotional and psychological. Families would see their loved ones enduring excruciating symptoms, and the loss of a child due to scarlet fever was a heartbreaking experience that left lasting scars on families and communities. Moreover, the impact of scarlet fever extended beyond individual cases. Schools and public gatherings were often shut down to contain the spread of the disease, leading to disruptions in education and social life. Despite the hardships faced, the devastating scarlet fever epidemics of the 19th century played a significant role in advancing medical knowledge. The study of scarlet fever contributed to the development of modern microbiology and the understanding of infectious diseases. The scarlet fever epidemics in the 19th century were a dark period, characterised by immense pain and suffering. The disease caused physical, emotional and social hardship, leaving communities devastated. However, these challenges paved the way for advancements in medical science. During the 19th century, scarlet fever was a significant concern, as it could lead to serious complications if left untreated. These complications included rheumatic fever, which affected the heart, joints and nervous system, as well as kidney diseases. Scarlet fever was also associated with a higher risk of mortality, especially in young children. Treatment for scarlet fever in the 19th century typically involved isolation to prevent the spread of the disease and symptom management. This included bed rest, plenty of fluids and medications to reduce fever and relieve symptoms. However, there were limited effective treatments available at the time, and some cases resulted in severe complications or death. With the advancements in medical knowledge and the introduction of antibiotics in the early 20th century, scarlet fever became more easily treatable. Today, scarlet fever is still occasionally seen, but is much less common and more manageable due to prompt medical interventions. Richard MUNSLOW died on the 23rd of April 1906, aged 74, and his wife Anne died aged 77 on the 3rd of August 1918. Richard was the last known Sineater, but unlike those who came before him, who no doubt chose the occupation because they were poor, it seems Richard chose to take the responsibility on out of his unbearable grief, a sense of guilt, or did he feel his faith had been tested? We will never know. But something we do know is that this tale does have somewhat of a happy ending. Richard and Anne's two daughters, Mary Ann and Annie, did go on to live full lives. Mary Ann got married and went on to live to the age of 78, and Annie, her younger sister, also got married and died in 1950, aged 73, after having 8 children.